Are these the best Terraria weapon arts? I don't know, you judge. What would realistic Terraria weapons look like? One of my favorite things about Terraria are the weapons. Beautiful sprites and beautiful animations. Yet, one question lingers. Could I make them even better? Possibly illustrate a more realistic version of themselves? This is part 3 of the series, Amateur Artist Tries to Illustrate Terraria Weapons, where I will be illustrating 3 hard mode weapons and turning them into possibly the best Terraria weapon arts yet. And let me tell you, you're going to see an amateur artist in action, doing some very amateur things. However, the end result will be a spectacle to look at. Now, before I start illustrating the Terraria sprite, I feel like there's one important thing that I really need to mention. And that is, what does the sprite actually look like? Well, through research, with the help of the official Terraria wiki, it states here in the trivia section that it's inspired from a Greek mythology about a skilled craftsman and his son who were imprisoned, and I feel like this is already familiar to you. You know that guy who flew too close to the sun and his wings melted away and then he fell down to his death? Yeah. Anyway, there is an addition to this point that states the wings that Daedalus crafted were made of feathers and curved to look like those of a bird. Fittingly, the Daedalus Stormbow's limbs appear as a pair of feathery wings, and this centerpiece is probably a crystal. Now, you can see that I also added the Holy Arrow. These two weapons are a great combo. It's a destroyer. Anyway, I started off by making the rough sketch of the bow, sketching all of the essential components of the sprite, and since I want to suffer, I decided to 3D this thing. In fair warning, I will be using art terms that I don't fully understand. After making the rough sketch, it's time for the outline. I decided to do the wings first because I know that outlining the feathers would be an absolute pain. And unsurprisingly, they were. My fingers did not have a fun time at all. Yeah, they aren't really the best, but I don't really care. Then, I outlined the grip and crystal. I was trying to make a design that looked appealing to look at, and I wasn't really satisfied. So, I changed it a couple of times. Starting off with this. When I wasn't satisfied with that, I made this thing? I attempted to incorporate a design into it, but I know how that went. Then I created this design and decided to add these curves and ball thingy for some style. I don't really know why other than I got it from a reference. I mean, it looks really cool, so I guess I'll keep it for now. With the bow sorted, I started adding the projectiles. I mentioned earlier that these projectiles, which in this case are arrows, will be holy arrows. And one of the projectiles that the holy arrow spawns when it hits the ground are these holy stars that rain down on the same spot the arrow landed on. So I included those as well. Since I didn't want these arrows to look too boring to look at, I added some style to it. Looks like we got that sorted. I mean, I feel like that's good enough. I don't know what you were expecting, to be honest. It's time to fill in the bow and arrows. Wait a second. Where did those curves go? Oh, I removed them. They just looked too weird and didn't follow the original sprite. And guess what? I decided to change the centerpiece again. And since I wanted to do that, I had to remove the filling in the outlines. Don't worry too much though, as this will be the final change. Well, with all that done, let's add some actual color now. Looking at this so far, I feel really confident that this will look good. But I still have to do some details. Starting off with detailing the wings. Detailing this was not fun. If there was one thing that was really outside of my comfort zone, it was detailing these wings. The shadows, the details, the lighting, it was difficult for me to incorporate. And it was very obvious in the first attempt. It's ugly, not interesting, and it's a disgrace to the art community. So, that's thrown out of the window. Then came attempt number 2. I added some value variation to different feathers on the wings. The value change is gradual, yet I added some detail and variation to make it more interesting.
And comparing it to the first attempt, it already looks a lot more interesting to look at. Then attempted to make shadows on the feathers. I had to apply this on all of the feathers on both wings, so my fingers had to suffer some more. But after all of that, I finally did it. Let's deal with the centerpiece. I want this crystal in the center to glow bright pink. I don't really care if the sprite doesn't show that. I think it will look cool. I added some reflections and changed the outline to white to emphasize the fact that it's glowing. Then for the grip, it's just simple details. I wanted it to look metallic. And finally, let's color the centerpiece. I feel like I could make this a lot more interesting. So, I saturated it and added more details. Now it looks a whole lot better. Perhaps, maybe I could add one more thing. There we go. That's the main sprite complete. Now, there's just the projectiles left. The arrows and the stars. Here's a list of things that I need to deal with before I finish the artwork. And let's cross all of them out with a montage. There we have it, the Daedalus Stormbow complete. This is honestly one of the best things that I've ever made, even though it doesn't really make any sense. Like, why are these arrows falling down? How do you shoot an arrow using this bow? This laser makes no sense. This string is not stable. If you were holding this bow, you'd be dead because these arrows are falling towards you. And yeah, these questions are valid, but remember, it's all for show. Who knows how this weapon works? Why the weapon is this way? It's all part of a fantasy. And because it took me 20 days and I want to be done with this. The process of making the sky fracture was a lot more straightforward. Starting off by staring at the sprite, then staring at the trivia section. And I did find one interesting thing in the trivia section, which I'll talk about later. Let's begin with the sketch. Starting off with the blade, then the hilt of the sword. The sky fracture is actually a really interesting weapon. It's like a sword, but it isn't really. It's like a staff where wherever you point it, it shoots 3 swords that act like missiles and hit your foes. It's really simple. Let's begin with the sketch. Starting off with the blade. There was a lot of adding stuff to certain parts to make it look interesting. Like this thing, this star on the hilt, and these 2 bolts on the rod. For some of the additions, they add a lot of interest to the weapon, while for the others, I would much rather not include them. You may be wondering though, why am I adding extra stuff when the sprite clearly doesn't show them? Because I can, and I feel like they will look too boring without them, which isn't really good for a YouTube video. Come on man, let me just express my creativity. With the main weapon done, it's time for the projectiles. Now, as I have shown earlier in the trivia section, the attack animation of the Sky Fracture resembles the Gate of Babylon from the Fate Media franchise published by Type Moon, where a variety of weapons spawn from a summoning vortex and once ready, hits the enemies like a barrage of missiles. Well, the Sky Fracture spawns 3 swords that are like missiles and fly towards your enemies. And these 3 swords that spawn will have one of the 12 projectile sprites. I picked these 3 because I wanted to add a bit of variation to the projectiles. And the process was a breeze compared to the wings. But one common denominator was present. Finger pain. But thankfully, after finishing the projectiles and adding some extra details for more interest, the pain was finally over. Now it's time to add the coloring. I decided to add the base colors instead and see where it takes me. And now it's time to detail the blade. 1. Gradient. The sprite shows a gradient on the blade from sky blue to cyan, maybe to give the weapon a more of an enchanted feel? 2. On the sprite, there's this dark spot here on the bottom of the blade, which I added on the illustration. Detailing the blade was a lot of fun, and it was nice to see it look more expressive. But that was the easy part. The hilt was like the wings, except it was a hilt. I just didn't know how to detail it. But then I remembered. It's just a cylinder but with some other shapes impregnated into it. So if I just light it like a cylinder, then it should work. That didn't really help, and it took me a while to get the hilt at least look alright. Yeah, it looks good enough. Anyway, since this is a magic weapon, I did add some particles surrounding the weapon, and a star on the tip. This looks very familiar. Then these lines, and some sparkles. That's the main weapon complete. Now for the projectiles, I added this aura or summoning circle below them. If you look at the attack animation of the Sky Fracture when the swords are summoned, a small summoning circle forms behind the swords and radiates outwards. It's just a bunch of swirls with some glow and particles. And for the projectiles, a bit of glow, some effects to look cool, and at last, a swirl in the Sky Fracture, because why not? That's the Sky Fracture complete. For a weapon that I never really cared about in the beginning, it's nice to see how well I've turned this sprite into this amazing spectacle. And it made me appreciate a lot more about this weapon. A sword that acts like a staff. Really cool. It looks very ethereal. I love it. Anyway, it's time for the final weapon. Making this weapon is the epitome of trust the process. From doubt to appreciation. From mess to a better mess. I mean beauty. Now, Excalibur. I have heard that name before, didn't I? Not just in Terraria, right? Remember that sword on the stone? King Arthur? Yes, that's it. The original sword though looks really different from the one in Terraria. The Terraria sprite is really interesting, and I'll get over the sprite's details while I make the illustration. Speaking of which, let us start off with sketching the sprite. I was having trouble whether I would make this sword thick like the sprite, or thin like the original. I wanted this sword to be a mix of both the original and Terraria sprite, and initially, I made a low quality sketch of the Excalibur sprite, but I didn't like how it looked. And I eventually decided to make it look more like the original. Starting with the sketch again, then the outlines. Let's ignore the guard for now. As you know, the blade on the Excalibur sprite has an interesting design, with some interesting elements. One of these are the red spots, or gems on the blade. These gems basically divide the blade into 4 segments, with the top 3 segments having a white center, and the bottom segment having a red center. Below that is another gem. Let's make a simple guard for now. Alright, there's still a lot more things to do. Let's design these white sections on the sword. Leaving it straight like this isn't too interesting, so I decided to put effort into adding a little bit of design. Designing it was really fun. So fun in fact that I decided to zoom into the outlines. Wait, no, not that much, goodness me. It's good enough. I just hope the lighting and details will improve this. Then, for the gem on the guard of the blade, I added some interesting features surrounding it. Okay, what now? Oh yeah, the guard. I had a lot of trouble with the guard. On the sprite, it looks like a ring. So I tried adding that to my outlines, but yeah, no bueno. I tried again with a more improved design, and even though it looks unnatural because of how curvy it is, unlike the rest of the outlines, it looks good enough. Coloring time! Now, adding lighting and details to the Excalibur was basically trial and error. It was a mess, honestly. Basically me just spamming different brushes together to see whether at least it has some realistic resemblance. To be honest, this was all due to layering issues. Plus, I didn't really like the design of the blade in the first place, so I tried to add it using some blending light on one side of the sword. As I continued detailing and adding mediocre lighting, however, I liked how the weapon looked as a whole. My messy approach actually worked? Yeah. And after adding a bit more details and designs, the Excalibur is complete. Wait, the slash. Oh, right. Well, as I stated earlier, when you swing the sword, a slash appears behind it and scatters particles as well. The notable aspects of the slash is the star, the 3 white curves on the slash, this brighter segment over here, and the spiky slash. And now, for the last montage of this episode, let's finish the slash. And there we have it. This is really the Sword of Purity. Compared to the illustration that I made of the Knight's Edge, it's interesting to see how two vastly different weapons, unholy versus holy, can come together to create one of the most iconic weapons of the entire game. Which is fitting, because that weapon is literally the embodiment of our world. Surprise, surprise, I will illustrate this weapon on the next episode. This is the best sword illustration that I've ever made, even though it's quite messy. The slash especially makes it look like it's on fire. Because it is fire. Holy fire. Man, it's just beautiful. Anyway, if you wanna see more of these videos, check out my Terraria weapon illustrations playlist, or you can also check out my Terraria landscape illustrations playlist. I would like to see you comment on this video and share your thoughts about the video or the illustrations that I made. Anyways, thank you for watching and go and do what you were meant to be doing.